Halloween is coming up, so I've written a ghost story. I couldn't get it down to 5 minutes, so I'm going to read an extract, but you can read the whole thing on my blog, jcollyer.wordpress.com. It's in live. Right, here we go. This is awareness. I'm just going for a slash, Dad. I'll be back in a minute. He staggered off behind one of the great shoulders of stone that jutted from the hilltop like teeth. Huddling down in the shadows to get away from the stare of the moon, he held his head in his hands and tried once again to slow his breathing. Even with his eyes closed, it was still there. Everyone said it was all in his mind. Even when he'd opened his eyes to see it bent over his bed, its blurry face a mass of crumpled flesh and bone, inches from his own, it was all in his head. Flossing his eyes open, he tried to ignore the thing that wasn't really there over his shoulder by looking at anything else. The crooked finger of a ruined bell tower loomed on his left. It had been impressive when he'd seen it earlier that day, in the watery winter sunshine, but now, in the frosty moonlight, shadows pooled in the cracked stonework and distorted the angles and height, making it look like it was leaning over him. The last time the bell was rung by the living, the landlord of the old bell had said, was to call for help that never came. The last holy man to serve at this place had been pushed to his death from the tower as he vainly rang the bell to summon the villagers to his aid. Matt felt a shiver run through his flesh at the story. Ben's scream, suddenly loud again in his ears. The bell is still heard sometimes, someone else in the pub had whispered to them. It was a call to judgment, a call to atone. The villagers had left the Catholic priest to his fate to appease the forces of the Reformation. The soldiers left the place in peace, but the priest is still waiting for the village of Senwick to admit what it did. Someone had asked what Matt and his dad were doing there at this time of year. There had been an odd silence when they'd explained. The county was famous for its lack of light pollution. Amateur astrologers like his dad flocked to the village all year round to observe and photograph the night skies from the top of Priory Hill. There was always a distinct lack of them at this time of year, his father had said. He assumed it was just too cold even for the most passionate of them. But this year, on this night, it was to be a lunar eclipse, and when the moon was passing closer to the earth than it had done for generations. His father had thought it would be a welcome distraction. If only leaving home could have let him get away from what had happened. When night fell, the familiar cold was at his back again. It didn't need to whisper in his ear anymore for Matt to know what it wanted to say. He stared hard at the bell tower, refusing to focus on something cold and pale that was hovering at the corner of his vision. His heart clutched in his chest like a fist, as the low, dead voice of a bell echoed out into the night. 1, 2, 3 times. A high human voice rang out with it, distorted and weak like it was from far, far away. It dissolved into a sickening scream, clawing at his ears and his head and his heart, for what seemed like forever, until he was swamped by the silence that followed. The light started to dim. Even though his rational mind knew it must be the eclipse, his heart jerked. Silence and darkness swallowed everything around him, and he closed his eyes and ears against it, afraid of what might show itself. He wondered if this was what death was like. Sight, sounds and smell all fading like existence was being leached away. A whole forever later, he dared to crack an eye. The moonlight had started to return, bleaching the broken rock bones that were scattered around him. He shook himself and got shakily to his feet. Nothing moved or made a noise. "Dad," he called. "Dad, are you there?" He started to pick his way back round to his father when something caught his eye. At first it looked like another pile of stones, hunched against the bottom of the bell tower. Then, as he passed closer, it looked more like crumpled linen. He found himself edging still closer. It took on the shape of a bent and broken body, awkwardly angled, pale as the moon and utterly still. He choked back the bile that rose in his throat, but something behind him wouldn't let him step back. He found himself bending over the cracked and splintered thing, made even more hideous in the sickly light, only identifiable as something once human by the complete but bloody hands, stretched as if still trying to seize something. Control returned to his feet and he stumbled backwards, staggering back round the wall. Their chairs were there, illuminated in the moonlight. Torches, blankets and bags were all neatly piled where they put them, but his dad was nowhere to be seen. He opened his mouth to call, but stopped as he got the hideous impression that something was getting to its feet behind him. He ran, calling out as he went. No one answered. He raced blindly down the side of the hill, not daring to look back, hardly daring to look ahead, staggering and stumbling on the uneven ground. Trying to stop his ears, he ran down the path into the village. The old bell was still well lit on the other side of the square, and he could hear music and laughter from inside. He paused to catch his breath, but then something was breathing, staggering and bleeding close behind him. He took off across the square, nearly tripping over the steps into the pub. He leaned hard against the door after it slammed behind him.